tonight. Tonight is a huge night in the Bernie Sanders for President campaign. They're calling tonight the organizing kickoff of the Bernie Sanders for President campaign across the country. We reported at the very end of the show last night on one of the larger meetings that is planned around this big Bernie effort tonight. We talked about one happening in Cincinnati. And because of the size of the venue they were planning on for this meeting in Cincinnati, I assumed that Bernie Sanders himself was going to be there. Turns out he's not. Bernie Sanders is not doing any big in-person appearances out in the world tonight. He's just on a video stream. But he's done it to more than 3,000 events. More than 3,000 Bernie for President events that happened or are happening all over the country tonight. Here's the map showing where all these events are. There are more than 3,500 of them across the country in all 50 states, organized in everything from meeting halls and big conference venues to people's living rooms. I looked on the map near where I live in Western Mass, and most of the events there seem to be already RSVP'd as totally full. By the time I was checking earlier this evening, they're doing more than 3,500 events across the country simultaneously, and they say they got more than 100,000 people RSVP'd to be attending these various events tonight. 100,000 people? When Bernie Sanders first indicated that he was going to run, he got this really big grassroots response of people who wanted not just to donate to his campaign, but to volunteer on his campaign. And I remember asking him on this show whether or not he felt like he was going to be able to handle the logistics of that much interest. And at the very beginning of his campaign, he did seem a little bit daunted about dealing with all of that interest, about scaling up his campaign to be able to handle that many people wanting to get involved. But it's been a couple of months now, and them tonight trying to pull off more than 3,500 simultaneous events with more than 100,000 participants shows that they think, at least, that they have scaled up their staffing and their infrastructure and their technical side enough that they can start turning all of that interest in his candidacy into what they hope will be real momentum for his campaign. We shall see. But here's where it all comes together. Because while the Republicans are completely focused on polling right now, because Fox News has decided national polling is how the Republican candidates are going to be allowed into or kept out of the presidential debate next week. While that focus on polling is happening on the Republican side, nobody's really been watching the polls on the Democratic side. Hillary Clinton, obviously way out ahead, still honestly the prohibitive favorite to win the nomination. And you do see Bernie Sanders pop up and get closer to her here or there, and in New Hampshire in one recent poll or in some other state. But one of the things that has happened since Bernie Sanders has been running this unexpectedly hot campaign on the Democratic side is that some smart pollsters have started to do head-to-head polling, general election head-to-head polling for the various Republican candidates, and they're no longer setting up the various Republican candidates just head-to-head against Hillary Clinton. They've started now setting up the various Republican candidates head-to-head against Bernie in the event that he wins the nomination. So last week, PPP polled Bernie Sanders versus Jeb Bush as a general election matchup. They showed Jeb Bush beating Bernie by 7 points. They polled Marco Rubio against Bernie, showed Marco Rubio beating him by 5 points. They showed Scott Walker up against Bernie Sanders in a hypothetical general election, Scott Walker beating Bernie Sanders by only 1 point. But when it came to a general election head-to-head matchup between Democratic presidential nominee Bernie Sanders and Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump, turns out Bernie Sanders wins by 10. So that was last week, PPP. Then this weekend, CNN did the same head-to-head polling. And the head-to-head polling for Hillary Clinton shows her beating all the Republican candidates by really big margins. As you can see here, she's beating Jeb Bush, she's beating Scott Walker, she's beating Donald Trump by a mile. Right? But that same poll also did head-to-head polling on Bernie Sanders versus those same candidates. And it turns out Bernie Sanders in the CNN national poll beats them all too. Bernie Sanders beats Jeb Bush by 1 point. He beats Scott Walker by 6 points. Bernie Sanders beats Donald Trump in the latest CNN poll nationwide. Latest CNN poll nationwide has Bernie Sanders beating Donald Trump in a hypothetical general election matchup, has him beating him by 20 points, which is more than Hillary Clinton would beat Trump by in the same poll.